First of all, I'm really humbled to be here. I'm really grateful to have been invited by the organizers of the Dialogue Society. I feel really grateful to be in the presence of many actual professors, even some emeritus professors and consultants and such. And I hope that you can still find even just a sliver of wisdom and value in what I want to share. What my paper argues and centers around was inspired by something that's already been brought up a little bit in even just the workshop today. For example, Professor Mike Ward mentioned in his presentation about the some of the drawbacks of just assuming that holding dialogue in itself is an end rather than just a means to an end. It was also brought up that engagement isn't enough in its own or on its own. And in some cases, is a dialogue even successful anyway? Is it even the right approach, or can it just exacerbate issues that were already there? So without further ado, I'll just go into exactly which attributes am I focusing on that are necessary for each party to embody in order for a dialogue to be successful in resolving a conflict, and what is my methodology in writing the paper and looking at the research. I was first inspired by, some of you might be familiar with the Arbinger Institute and their renowned work, The Anatomy of Peace, which takes a sort of a narrative approach with fictionalized characters, but based in real truth and principles surrounding conflict resolution. For example, a pair of organizers of this camp where all of these individuals come, all these parents come to bring their kids who are dealing with familial conflict. That's Avi Rosen, who is a Jewish Israeli, and Yusuf Salah, who is a Palestinian Muslim Arab. They have this quote, which is, and I apologize, I'll need to turn around a couple of times, but they say, generally speaking, we respond to others' way of being toward us rather than to their behavior. Furthermore, they continue, most problems in the world are not failures of strategy, or I would even say methods, such as dialogue being a method, but failures of way of being. And so I wanted to take this approach in discussing dialogue as a method where our way of being comes into play. They even use an example of Salah ad-Din, or Saladin, who was a Kurdish leader in the Crusades against invading Christian forces. They discuss his method, his way of being, saying that he saw and honored the humanity of those he conquered. He may have honestly wished they had never come to the borders of his lands, but he recognized that these were people that he was dealing with in battle, and so he honored them as such. So his way of being was very significant in his approach to doing battle with the Christians during the Crusades. So that's one example. Now, the first kind of case study, which has somewhat been maybe done to death at this point in the field of conflict resolution, but it's ground worth retreading, is that of Muhammad al-Kamil, the Sultan of Egypt at the time of the Fifth Crusade, and Saint Francis of Assisi. And some of the information that I will be using incorporates information from many different scholars, but also from a film that was produced called The Sultan and the Saint, that also incorporates a lot of scholarly work. So first, for some historical context about the Crusade. So Pope Urban II issued a call to Christian followers at the time using language such as this. It was mentioned before, kind of populist rhetoric. This would be populist rhetoric infused with religious language, kind of weaponized religious language. He called Christians to struggle for your Jerusalem and that by the power invested in him by God, he would forgive the sins of those who embarked on this crusade. So it was really a spiritual crusade. It was almost an ordinance for people who embarked on this, if you will. And because of this, there's really not much language, there's not much room given for humanizing the people that already lived in harmony in Jerusalem at the time, because it wasn't their Jerusalem in the first place. So looking at Francis, looking at both of these figures in their upbringing, like the preparation that they went through to develop attributes for their eventual encounter to be successful before they had either of their titles. First we have Francis. As the story goes, he was a bit of a drifter, drinking, indulging in the social activities of the time. But he had a few key humbling experiences, you could say, that helped him to develop, well, humility for one, but helped him to develop some attributes that would prepare him. He was imprisoned during an intercity war in Italy at the time, and was only able to escape through, or be let out through ransom, which his father paid, which is a pretty, one might say, humiliating experience. But only 5 years later, whilst still being humbled by this initial experience, he was also traveling, and he encountered a group of lepers who historically, socially, scripturally, are a very dehumanized out-group, you could say, and weren't seen as human. It wasn't common to see the humanity in them, but he did, and he was able to see that God is mindful, in his eyes, God is mindful of all people and is a loving God. And this, according to research, became more of the foundation for his whole ministry. We can even see in the now famous prayer of St. Francis language such as this, and this would even become, well, this was written, I believe, long after his encounter with the Sultan Muhammad al-Kamil, and we have language such as, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace, and grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, and as was mentioned by the previous speaker, to be understood and to understand, etc., etc. This goes very strongly against the prevailing narrative or the view of God at the time as being a very vengeful God, and rather he saw him as a God of love and of humanity. Now, going to Muhammad, in his youth, he loved studying his religion. He spent time memorizing the Quran with his parents from a young age. He loved studying philosophy. He loved studying mathematics. He was already being reared to be very open to learning and to challenge his own perspective, even though he was still a devout Muslim. And one notable example that has been cited is of when he was solving a religious dispute between local Christians and Muslims. They were arguing over whether or not to build a mosque or a church on a specific site. And one would think, him being a Muslim, that he would be biased towards a house of worship, towards his own faith being built there, but actually he conceded to what the Christian Egyptians asked at the time, and said that they had the right to build a church there. And he was known throughout his rule to have very good relations with Christian Egyptians. So he already has interaction with Christians and is very open. Meanwhile, Francis is developing sympathy and humility through his own experiences. Now, already going forward to the encounter that they had, Assisi came and he was very honest. He didn't attack Muhammad's religion, but he came to convert him. He aimed to convert the entire army of his, if he could, and bring the gospel to them. And When they actually did encounter face-to-face, he honestly declared this goal in his visit and wanted to teach them. But I want to make a point here as well, that it's important to still be honest in our goals and our intentions in any dialogue setting. Obviously, I'm not speaking against political correctness. Political correctness actually can be really good. But politeness in lieu of actually voicing your concerns and your own agenda can lead to more misunderstanding, therefore more conflict, rather than resolving it. Going forward, Muhammad allowed Francis to address his entire court, and they had what's been described by a Franciscan historian as a faith exchange, not so much an intellectual debate. And this would eventually lead to an end to the Fifth Crusade. Pelagius, who was an emissary of the Pope to Damietta in Egypt, wanted to press forward militarily, but Muhammad and his troops actually were able to flood them using a portion of the Nile, and they all got very sick, and they were held back. He could have defeated them, but Muhammad decided to give them bread and to give them sustenance and to accept a peaceful end to the conflict. And so we can see that this dialogue and exchange did have a successful outcome, not so much for the Christians, but it was a peaceful end. And to just a little anecdote here, at the beginning of this year, there was the 800th anniversary of the visit of St. Francis of Assisi to Muhammad al-Kamil. And this has implications now where Pope Francis and Muhammad al-Isa, who is the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, met. And they look practically to these attributes embodied in these former figures from 800 years ago. So there are practical implications for embodying these attributes in a dialogue. Now, I'm a little shorter on time than I'd hoped, so I'm unfortunately going to have to speed through this portion. But another example that I looked at in my paper is that of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, and their resolving an ending of apartheid in South Africa, and what sort of attributes they each embodied. So firstly, historical context. Apartheid was in place since 1948 because of the support from the Nationalist Party and also the white minority living in fear of losing their own power in South Africa. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela founded the military wing of the ANC, of the African National Congress, to fight against apartheid. He was arrested when he was only about 48, 49 in 1962, was put in prison in Robben Island, and then eventually into another prison in Pollsmoor between 1982 and 1988. Now, during this time, in prison, Nelson Mandela really cultivated some attributes that would be instrumental in his discussions, in his dialogues with F.W. de Klerk, who became the president of South Africa. He insisted on learning Afrikaans, which many of the oppressed refused to speak, but he felt it, and this really interested me, that he felt absolutely compelled to learn the language of the enemy in order to communicate with them. And he also developed great cultural understanding of cultural symbols, traditions, and like rugby and the springbok as a symbol to bring together African and Afrikaner traditions. He also was honest, just as St. Francis of Assisi was in announcing his goal to Muhammad. He hoped to defeat them. There was a discussion earlier of seeing the chessboard from your enemy's perspective, maybe not to actually empathize with them, but to win. He was willing to listen, and now looking at, let's skip here, F.W. de Klerk, he also embodied some attributes that were very instrumental in their encounter. He was very honest in defending the white South African minority. He believed that if South Africa continued its policy of apartheid, that it would be boycotted globally, and there would be no economy. It would be, they would have the equivalent of a civil war. But he was very peaceful in wanting to bring about change in cooperation with Mandela. And let's see. So yeah, so we know the outcome, that they were able to hold a successful dialogue, and this was due to the preparation that they went through, same as with St. Francis of Assisi, Muhammad al-Kamil, who had these key attributes. And lastly, my very last point that I want to bring up is, I can't be an American on the 28th of November and not bring up Thanksgiving. So William Bradford, who is an ancestor of mine, wrote extensively of his encounters with the Native Americans, and this is something that I want to do more research on and add to my paper, is whether or not the history actually is reliable. As the tradition goes, William Bradford met with Squanto, a member of the Wampanoag tribe, and they had a successful dialogue, and they celebrated through a feast of Thanksgiving. But having done already just a little research on my own, and others have done the same, there are gaps in this history that suggest that the dialogue might not have been so clear-cut, and it might not have been, well, the history that we are celebrating might not be altogether accurate. And so I wish to be truthful and to incorporate that as well. But yes, that's the research that I've done.